Sorry, boy, but his captain's got to teach his men what happens to those what crossing.
Captain's got to teach stuff.
Good afternoon from the Bat Cave. It is Saturday, September 3rd, 2022, and I'm going to try to keep going on this series about the New Covenant. Still focused on how the New Covenant is kind of hidden in the Old Covenant and how its ordinances and things are the implication of the need of the New Covenant, and then some of the specifics of the New Covenant are kind of there in a shadow type. So we're going to focus on now the life of Moses, and Moses is going to be kind of basically his life is going to be kind of a type of the failure of the Old Covenant, and the life of the the life of the Israelites who came out of Egypt with him, at least the adults. They're going to be a type of the failure of the Old Covenant. Whereas by the time you get to the end of the wilderness wanderings and those Israelites who actually go into the Promised Land, they're going to be a type of the New Covenant. And the one who replaces Moses to actually lead them into the Promised Land is Joshua, which, if you know your Hebrew, is going to be a transliteration of the word Jesus. So it's essentially showing how Moses can't take you into the Promised Land, but Jesus can, because the true Promised Land is the new heavens and the new earth. The Promised Land of Israel is kind of a foretype of the new heavens and the new earth, which ultimately we can't come into without Christ. So we're going to start back in the book of Exodus, and I'm just going to kind of walk you through the life of Moses. So book of Exodus starts with basically the names of the Israelites who came out of Egypt and how Moses was spared despite Pharaoh's decree that everybody of the firstborn of Israel must die. Then he by chapter 2, it's going to get into how he is raised in the house of Pharaoh. He's found by I think it's the daughter of one of the pharaohs, and so he actually becomes kind of the cousin of the heir apparent in Israel. If you've ever seen the Moses movie, if you get into your extra biblical Jewish history, which you're going to find this in Josephus. Moses actually was a prince and a general in Egypt. He actually conquers Ethiopia, so those parts from the Ten Commandments movie are based on that extra biblical Jewish tradition, and that's where he actually marries a princess of Egypt. So that's how, when we get into the book of Numbers later, they're gonna his sister Miriam and Aaron are going to dispute with him over having a Cushite wife. We're going to find out that Cushite wife was actually married to him. She was a princess of Ethiopia. So basically, we're going to he's going to grow up there, and when he gets to a point where he says, "It came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out unto his brethren and looked upon their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren." So there's no indication, like with the movie Ten Commandments, that Moses actually decides to go out and become a slave like his fellow Egyptians or like his fellow Hebrews. It just says he went out unto his brethren and looked upon their burdens. That's all we know from the scriptures, that he went out and just to see what it was like. And he saw an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, and he looked this way. This is really pointed. He looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So this is very much premeditated murder. He didn't just murder him in a rage. He looked this way, he looked that way, he made sure nobody was looking, and then he murdered this guy. I never caught that before. It's just there's those little things like that where he made sure nobody was looking, and then he murdered this dude. Up here, this is your first major type of the Old Covenant here. Moses tries to save Israel by his own hand. He tries to be a ruler and a judge to deliver them from their oppressors by their own hand. And what does he become? A premeditated murderer. So think about that. So those who sit in Moses' seat, what do they do at the end when they believe they're saving Israel by their own hand? Well, they become premeditated murderers of Jesus Christ. Okay? So he buries him in the sand. He hid him in the sand. And then he goes out and he sees these two Hebrews striving together. And he said to him that did the wrong, wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killedst the Egyptian? Killedst the Egyptian? So there's some things in the King James that do beg a modernization. Killedst the Egyptian? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killedst the Egyptian? And Moses feared, and he said, surely this thing is known. So he's like, he knows this dude is dead, and they know it's known that he did it. So Moses is like, crap. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. So Pharaoh was actually going to kill Moses over this. It was known that Moses murdered this dude. It was reported to Pharaoh. These are all things that I don't remember from my picture Bible growing up. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Okay, so he is going to flee, and he's ultimately going to flee for 40 years after being a murderer. This is important because how long does Israel spend in the wilderness before they're allowed to go in the promised land? And the answer is 40 years. Okay. So then it says, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the water of their father's flock. So notice he's fleeing, he's among the Gentiles, and there are 7 daughters. So Moses is going through a change here. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. And when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, how is it that you came so soon today? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hands of the shepherds, and he also drew water for us and watered the flock. And he said unto his daughters, where is he? And why is it that you have left the man, and call him, that he may eat bread? And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses support his daughter. So he essentially rescues this guy's daughters, waters their flock, and he gets a wife out of the deal, just like that. That's all he had to do. And she bare him a son and called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in the land. So here's Moses, rejected by Israel. They're gonna point this out in Stephen's gonna point this out in the book of Acts when he's giving a sermon about how they rejected him and said, who made you a prince and ruler over us? But on the other side of things, Moses is a premeditated murderer. He's trying to save them through secretly murdering people instead of leading them out of the promised land, or leading them out of Egypt. And then it said, it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried, and their cry came unto God by the reason of the bondage. Okay, so we know that the Pharaoh who killed all the firstborn, he probably would have died. This would have probably been the next Pharaoh after him dying, so this is going to probably be the 3rd Pharaoh in the life of Moses. And by this time, God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God looked upon the children of Israel and had respect unto them. Now, just a little few fun facts. Israel was not in Egypt 400 years. They're in Egypt's ballpark of 210, 215 years. That prophecy about the 400 years actually is accounting their overall oppression to the Egyptians and the Philistines in the land of Canaan, who were an Egyptian tribe. And so they're afflicted and they're persecuted and brought into bondage 400 years. So that total of all the problems they have is 400 years. And Paul is going to point this out in Galatians, how he's going to say how it's 434 years from Abraham receiving the covenant of circumcision to receiving the law. So there's 434 years there altogether. Roughly split that in half, and that's about how much time Jacob and his descendants were in Israel. And if you get into Jewish rabbinical tradition, they're going to tell you this too. It's about 210, 215 years. And if you count through the genealogies of them that were in Egypt, there were actually a total of 3 or 4 generations counted. So Moses's great grandfather would have been one of the children that went into Egypt with Jacob. So Moses, by the time he leads them all out, he's going to be 80 years old. So you're going to have, like I said, between the two between them, and then the 80 years of Moses' life, it's going to add up to around 210, 215 years. God's going to deliver them, and he's going to call Moses out to do it. So already Moses' life is kind of a type of the failure of the old covenant. He's trying to help, but he becomes a murderer. Okay? And then the Lord appears to him in the bush, and the Lord tells him to go and free your people Israel. And he says, who are you? And he says, I am that I am. And then he says, "Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say unto them, the Lord your God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me, saying, I have surely visited you, and I have seen which is done to you in Egypt. And I have said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt unto the land of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, unto a land flowing with milk and honey." Okay, so this land that they're being brought up to is a type of rest. Okay, it's a type of Sabbath rest, and the reason is because this land is flowing with milk and honey. Which that means is basically this land has been taken care of. It has been cultivated. These Canaanites have lived in this land pretty peacefully for about 400 years, and the reason is because 400 years earlier, they were under the oppression of they were under the oppression of King Amraphel of Shinar, who is Nimrod, and all of his confederacy, which is basically allied with him. They would go across the desert or go up and around the Fertile Crescent, and they would oppress the people of Seir, Edom, which became Edom, and then all the Canaanite areas. Well, Abraham defeats him when he goes to rescue Lot, and so from that time onward, Abraham's allies, the Amorites, actually become the dominant people in the Middle East, the people between the Jordan Valley and the Euphrates Valley. So they're actually going over there and now oppressing them. You can find this in history. And so the Amorites, since they're cousins to all the other Canaanites, and the Hittites actually become a powerful kingdom in the north, and they will compete with Egypt for the supremacy of Canaan. And the Philistines, who are there, are kind of an Egyptian garrison, not officially. They're an Egyptian tribe that looks like they sailed away up to Crete, and then they came into the Promised Land, and kind of just have some coastal cities there. So they're kind of like a beachhead. They're not. They don't really come to dominate all of Canaan at any point in time. But you kind of have this, the Amorites up in the northeast, and then all the way over to Mesopotamia, and then you have the Hittites in the north, which would be considered about central Turkey, and then the other Canaanite tribes are just going to be scattered throughout, but they're going to have their cities and stuff in the hilltop and the mountaintop cities that Israel would eventually occupy. So they're all in a pretty safe place. And because of that, not only that, they have Nephilim among them. They've got giants that basically somehow the Amorites and some of these Canaanite tribes got into producing Nephilim like in the days of Noah. It doesn't really get into how, but we know that Goliath would have been one of the last ones. Goliath and his brothers, who are killed by David and his mighty men, these are going to be the last ones, the last of the Nephilim. But when Joshua and Caleb get there, there's going to be Nephilim in the land, the sons of Anak. And these Nephilim are basically, they're huge. They're giants. We only know the size of a few of them, but we know one of them had like a 30-foot bed. We know Goliath was probably somewhere around 9-10 feet tall and built like thick, not just like a tall beanpole. It said he had a spear like a weaver's beam, which would have been about that thick around, which means he would have had to have hands like that made Shaq's hands look small. So because of this, these people are able to cultivate the land, they're able to grow crops and just really maximize the output. They probably honestly have some supernatural demonic help, and they probably have some demonically inspired technology. But they're able to grow huge grapes and stuff like that. And the land is ultimately flowing with milk and honey because their flocks and their herds and their cattle and their farms and everything is just doing great. So God is going to lead Israel into this land, and he's always going to talk about how I'm going to lead you into cities that you didn't build, fields you didn't plant, essentially all the stuff that you need to be this thriving civilization from this slavery that you're in Egypt is just going to be there ready to go for you. And that's a type of the new heavens and new earth, where we're going to go back to like a Garden of Eden type scenario and start over with eternal life. So, and he says, and they shall hearken to thy voice, and they shall come out, thou and all the elders of Israel, unto the kings of Egypt, and you shall say unto them, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now let us go, we beseech thee, 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. So this is important. You notice when God is calling them out, he's not proposing that he's going to make a covenant with them. What he's proposing is that they come out and make a sacrifice to him, and then he's going to lead them he's going to personally meet them and he's going to lead them into Canaan. Okay, that's what God's saying. He's never, there's no, you're not going to hear about this covenant until really the Jews deny God speaking to them. Okay, and this is what the book of Hebrews is going to cover. We'll get there when we get to that part. But he basically says, and I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go, not by a mighty hand, and I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders, and I will do it in the midst thereof, and after that he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it will come to pass that when you go, you shall not go empty, but every woman shall borrow of her neighbor, and her that sojourneth in her house, jewels of silver, jewels of gold, and raiment, and shall put them on your sons and your daughters, and you shall spoil the Egyptians. This is really interesting. He's basically telling them, I'm just borrowing this. I'm going to borrow. Let's see. Request, ask, borrow, lay to charge, consult, demand, desire. So maybe he's not like trying to get them to be duplicitous and borrow, that this word can be used, demand or ask. So basically, the Egyptians are going to be so scared of the Hebrews that when they ask for their gold and silver and stuff like that, the Egyptians are just going to give it to them. They're going to be so scared of them. Okay, so that's God's whole plan in hardening Pharaoh and then being able to destroy him. Now remember, when people get into God hardening Pharaoh, okay, the idea of him hardening Pharaoh as if it's like an unjust thing that God would do that, almost like God's just randomly hardening Pharaoh when Pharaoh would have otherwise been a decent guy. You have to remember, the Egyptians were supernaturally spared by the blessing that came through Joseph and his people Israel. From there, when Joseph was the prime minister of Israel, ultimately his people were in charge of keeping the flocks and herds of Pharaoh. So Joseph was personally responsible for the Pharaohs getting all their power in Egypt. So they were already kings there. They already had the power over the civil government there. But the idea of just having this absolute dictatorial power where they owned everything and the whole country was their servants, it wasn't like that. Their power, it was kind of a shared kind of balanced power with the priesthood, and there were like a lot of nations, you had kind of a tribal confederacy, and they were kind of the chief power among them. But when Joseph came in and had his 7 years of famine, followed by the 7 years of plenty, followed by the 7 years of famine, through that process, the pharaohs get absolute dictatorial power over all of Egypt. They get control of all the land of Egypt, and then the Hebrews come in and take care of Pharaoh's flocks and herds, and they're gifted at this. These people have been doing this for hundreds of years, and they're really good at it, and God's blessed them in it, and so they're multiplying his flocks and herds, and so the pharaohs get loaded at the hand of Israel. And of course, Joseph is the prime minister of Israel, which he probably took a lot of his family members into the administration of Israel, of Egypt. And so for a while, you had the Jews in prominent places in Egypt. They had a lot of wealth. They were very close to the pharaohs. And then it says a pharaoh came who didn't know Joseph. Well, more than likely what happened is either Joseph died and then there was a pharaoh in between, and then his son ultimately had never known Joseph, or there was a change of power, change of dynasty, and this new dynasty didn't know Joseph. So that's more likely what happened based on the correlating history, is that you had this other dynasty take over and become the pharaohs, and that dynasty, which I think their assumption is that this was either from the south of Egypt or a Nubian tribe, but I think it was just like another Egyptian tribe, basically takes over, and they don't know who Joseph is. So they don't see Israel as a blessing. They actually see them as a threat. And so they look at Israel and they go, okay, here's these people. One is they were given some pretty good land in Goshen to basically tend their flocks and cultivate and build houses and all this stuff. And they continue to flourish there for a while, but they're kind of on Egypt's northeastern border. And so this Pharaoh looks at the Jews as a potential threat, because they're like, well, one, we're not really related to them. Two, they've had a lot of power in Israel for some time. And three is they're more closely related to the people we might be threatened by. Because, for instance, they're related to all the Arabian tribes. That's where all the Hebrews are. And so you have the Ishmaelites, you have the Edomites, you have the sons of Joktan, all up and down the west coast of the east coast of the Red Sea, directly opposite of Egypt's borderland. They're all related to Israel. And so when he looks at that, he says, they're a threat to us, because if we get invaded by an outside force, because they're more closely related to these people who are opposite us, and they're not related to us, they're more likely going to side with our enemies against us. In other words, they become an ally to whoever's invading us, so that they don't have to fight that ally, because they're not going to be the front line of defense to defend Egypt against their enemies. And they're going to have a choice. Are they going to be for Egypt or against Egypt? And they'll probably side with their enemies. And so that's why they decide to oppress them. It's actually a very practical, strategic move to do that, except for the fact that if they had known who the Jews were and why they were there, they shouldn't have been threatened by that. But again, they don't trust the God of the Israelites. They don't trust the integrity of the Israelites. And we do learn from later prophets that the Israelites did intermarry, they mingled with the Egyptians, and they started practicing Egyptian idolatry. We get into that in the book of Ezekiel later on, where it makes it very clear that they were worshiping the idols of Egypt, and then later on they're going to worship the idols of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So it wasn't like they were just there and they were an isolated community. They were probably married in to, honestly, some of the top Egyptian families, because they would have been the prime minister's family. And when they left Egypt, there was probably a lot of mixture between Egyptian and Israelite among them. So, and it would have been the Egyptian dynasty that probably preceded this one. So they were also kind of attached to the family that had just gotten ousted, probably. Joseph was married to the high priest's daughter. So there's just a lot of connection between the Israelites and the preceding powers that be in Egypt. So anyways, this Pharaoh decides he's going to enslave them. Then they keep multiplying him, and I believe that this Pharaoh is eventually going to kill all the firstborn, and then it's his son who's going to kind of inherit all this. And so this Pharaoh is, God's like, okay, this is multiple generations of pharaohs who are doing evil to my people who've never done them harm. Okay? And so when he decides to harden this pharaoh and plunder Egypt through this, it's really justice being meted out. It's not God just taking a guy and deciding to harden him so that he can display his power for him. He is taking the opportunity to do that, but everything that God is doing is completely just in light of what has gone on historically. So anyways, he tells Moses, I'm going to give you some signs to do in front of them. They're not going to believe you, but stick your hand in your coat and it's going to come out leprous. Then they'll believe you. Make this stick turn to a snake. Then they'll believe you. And he's going to send Aaron to talk to him. And he says, when you stand before Moses, or when you stand before Pharaoh, he's going to make Aaron like your prophet, and you're going to be like God. Now, why is that? It's because Pharaoh is seen as a god, even though he's just a man. So he's going to make Moses be silent and Aaron speak for him, as if Aaron's the prophet and Moses is the god. And he's going to straight up oppose him head to head. Why? Why does God want him to be like a god to Pharaoh? And the answer is because he's a foretype of Christ. So he's a foretype of Christ. Who does that make Aaron a foretype of? The answer is John the Baptist. He's the herald that goes before the man who is like a god. Okay? And so they're going to go before Pharaoh, just like John the Baptist is going to go before Jesus, and he's going to start calling out Herod, who also killed all the firstborn babies. All the babies 2 years old and under in Bethlehem. So there's a lot of parallels between Herod and Pharaoh, and between Aaron and Elijah, and between Moses and Jesus. Okay? And so he goes back to Jethro and he says, I need to go. God says, I need to go. Jethro's like, aight. And then Moses basically is getting ready to go. And it says he took his wife and his son and set them on an ass, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand. God gives him this rod. Doesn't say where this rod came from, but it says it's the rod of God. And then this is what he says about Israel. Remember, God had changed Jacob's name to Israel, making him a type of Christ and a type of being born again. Okay? So he's going to say this about Israel. He says, "And thou shalt say to Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn." So take Israel is my son, my firstborn. He's calling Israel Jesus, his firstborn son. Okay? In a type. Okay? And this is part of the reason the Jews aren't going to accept Jesus. You're going to have these kind of arguments floating around in that time, because God's already established that the nation of Israel is his firstborn son. They see it as it's an allegory for the entire nation. It's not a single person who's actually going to be the son of God. But Israel is actually a foretype of Jesus. It's actually another name for Jesus, which is why Jacob is there. He's going to refer to Israel usually when he's prophesying things that often are about Jesus and about the believers in Jesus and about the church. He's going to use Jacob oftentimes when he's prophesying things that are about the ethnic or the carnal nation of Israel. So then he says, "And I say unto thee, let my son go, that he may serve me. And if thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn." Think about that. God is saying, this is a huge foretype of Christ and Antichrist here. God is saying, if you don't let my son go, I'm going to slay your firstborn son. So who's the firstborn of Pharaoh in a type? Well, that's going to be the Antichrist. He is going to be a type of this. Pharaoh is a type of Satan, always, of Lucifer himself. And his son's going to be a type of the Antichrist. And ultimately, he is going to try to enslave Israel and keep Israel in bondage through keeping them under the law. And God is going to slay his firstborn, which is the Antichrist. So Moses' life is apparently spared by his wife's actions of circumcising his son. And then Aaron ends up meeting up with Moses because God sends him. And then Moses goes back and he does the signs in front of the people with the leprosy and the sign of the snake. The rod being turned into a serpent, and then they believe him. And then he goes to Egypt, and we all know the story about the 10 plagues. Pharaoh says, "I will not let them go," and it keeps getting worse and worse and worse until he kills his son. And notice this is in chapter 7. "See, I have made thee a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron thy brother shall be thy prophet." So they're literally a foretype of Jesus and John the Baptist, and a foretype of the two witnesses. Okay? Which are actually going to be Moses and Elijah. So they battle it out with Pharaoh through the power of God. And this is going to go on until chapter 12, where they have the whole Passover and the slaying of the firstborn. Okay? And then they're going to go out from Egypt. And God is going to start giving them ordinances. "Sanctify unto me the firstborn, whoever openeth the womb from among the children of Israel, both of man and beast, it is mine." And Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which ye came out of Egypt, and out of the bondage, for the strength of thy hand the Lord brought you from this place. There shall be no leavened bread eaten. This day came ye out in the month of Abib." So he's starting to set up some of the ritual ordinances, which are meant to be in remembrance of what God did at the Passover, just like our communion is in remembrance of what Christ did for us on the cross. And he calls it a memorial. He says, "It shall be a sign unto thee and upon thine hand, and for a memorial between thine eyes, that the Lord's law may be in thy mouth. For with a strong hand hath the Lord brought thee out of Egypt." So God is going to prepare to basically give his law to Israel. This is not the old covenant yet. Okay? What it is, and this is all going to roll into the old covenant eventually, but he's basically preparing them to take him out to worship him, and he's going to give his law to them. Now remember, ultimately what they need is God's law written on their heart. Okay? But instead, they request a mediator between them and God. So they're going to go out. Pharaoh's going to try to stop them. Pharaoh's going to die. Miriam's going to sing a song of rejoicing. They're going to start getting manna. And then Israel's going to start to complain. First they complain, then they get the manna. Okay? Then they're going to start complaining again about water, and Moses is going to strike the rock, and it's going to make them water. Now, Paul says that the rock is Christ, who Moses strikes. So why is God instructing Moses to strike the rock to make water come out? And the answer is because this is a foretype of Christ being bruised for our transgressions. And ultimately, Christ dies when a guy stabs him with a spear and blood and water flows out. Moses is going to strike the rock and water is going to flow out, and that's going to save Israel by giving them water to drink. Just like Christ's blood is going to save us. And Moses is going to get to Sinai in Midian, back to where his in-laws are. His dad's going to meet them, and he's going to give Moses some good advice about setting up other people to co-rule with him. And then they're going to get to Sinai. He says, and Moses went up to God, and God called unto him out of the mountain, saying, Thou shalt say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. In other words, God rescued them by his own strength. Okay? Now, therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all the people, for the earth is mine. And you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nations. These are the words that thou shalt speak to the children of Israel. So this is where God offers them a covenant. Is he offering them the old covenant, or is he offering them the new covenant? This is the question. Okay? He just says, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure to me above all people, for the earth is mine. And you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Okay? So here's the important part. If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure, for the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These things are later going to be applied to the church. But in this, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant. So this is the old covenant. Their nation will serve as priests, as an intermediary between God and the world. That's what they're meant to be. Okay? So Moses came and called for the elders, and laid before the faces all the words that the Lord commanded him, and all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Okay? So there's the deal. If. And they say, All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So their elders agree to the covenant. It's a two-party covenant. God says, if you do this, then you'll be this. Then you'll be this nation. Okay? Notice he says, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you'll be a peculiar treasure to me above all people. Okay? So, if they obey his voice and keep his covenant, what if they don't obey his voice and keep his covenant? Are they still a peculiar treasure unto me above all people? And the answer is no. If they don't keep his covenant, then they're no longer a peculiar treasure to him above all people. They're no longer a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now this is going to create a problem for some of you because the calling and election of God are without repentance, right? Yeah. So how are they going to have this if clause here that's based on them keeping all that the Lord has spoken, which we know they don't do? They not only don't do it, they kill his son, So by this covenant, they're no longer this holy kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This covenant was always going to fail them. And this is them getting ready to enter into this covenant with the Lord. But we know from history they were always going to fail to keep it. So the Lord said to Moses, Lo, I come unto thee in a thick cloud, and all the people may hear when I speak with thee, and believe thee forever. I come unto thee in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with thee, and believe thee forever. What does that mean? He's saying he's going to come in a thick cloud, and they're going to hear God speak to Moses, and they're going to believe Moses forever. Okay? And Moses told the words of the people unto the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, Go unto the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and be ready against the third day. For the third day the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai. So he's actually showing up visibly. And thou shalt set bounds unto the people round about, saying, Take heed to yourselves that ye go not up into the mount, or touch the border of it. Whosoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. There shall not a hand touch it, but he shall surely be stoned or shot through. In other words, with a spear or an arrow. Whether it be a beast or a man, he shall not live. When the trumpet soundeth long, they shall come up to the mount. And Moses went down from the mount unto the people, and sanctified the people, and they washed their clothes. And he said unto the people, Be ready against the third day. Come not at your wives. In other words, don't have sex with your wives. And basically, they're going to sanctify themselves by not having sex for a few days, washing their clothes, and they're going to come up to the mountain, but not touch it. If they touch it, they die. But they are supposed to come up to it. And it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud upon the mount, and a voice of the trumpet exceedingly loud, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Now, what is going on here, typologically? Notice it's the third day. So you have Israel getting this covenant promise from the Lord. And they can go right up to the mountain. They're supposed to go into the mountain on the third day, and that's where the Lord's going to reveal himself to them. But if they try to go up into the mountain, they will die. Why? Well, we get into this later when we get into Hosea. And if you remember, Hosea has the prophecy in chapter 6 when they said, When will we return to the Lord? When will he, on the second day, or after 2 days, who will revive us? And on the third day, we'll live in his sight. Okay? This is a type of what they failed to do in the new covenant. See, on the third day, which is the third day after Christ comes, okay, so 3,000 years later, that's the ultimate, the millennium. And they are supposed to come right up to Christ, but they actually don't get to go into Christ. They don't get to go in personally to serve him. The rest of the world does. They don't. And the reason is, with the exception of David and the Sadducees, or the sons of Zadok, they don't. And the reason is because they go back to the old covenant, and they're not able to receive Christ. Now, doesn't mean they can't repent from that, but I mean that's ultimately what's going to happen. So then it says, It came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceedingly loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mount. And Mount Sinai was altogether on smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. So this is kind of a micro picture of God the Father here, where he's consuming fire clothed in thick darkness. Okay? And so this is how Jesus is appearing to them on Mount Sinai. It's probably the angel of the Lord appearing as a fire clothed in thick darkness. And when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, so remember how you have the trumpet sound on the third day, right? Just like Christ is going to appear at the sounding of a trumpet in the millennium, right before the millennium. Okay. Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice, and the Lord. So it says Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice, and the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai, and on the top of the mountain, the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mountain. Moses went up. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go down and charge the people, lest they break through to the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. And let the priests also, which come near to the Lord, sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. And Moses said unto the Lord, The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for thou chargest us, saying, Set bounds upon the mountain, sanctify it. And the Lord said unto him, Away, get thee down, and thou shalt come up, thou and Aaron with thee, but let not the priests and the people break through to come up unto the Lord, lest he break forth upon them. So Moses went down to the people and spake unto them. So he's telling Moses that him and Aaron can come up and talk to him, but nobody else. And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God that brought thee out of Egypt, out of the bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And he's going to verbalize the Ten Commandments to them. So all of Israel is going to hear him say the Ten Commandments to Moses. Okay? And it says, All the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountains smoking. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. So they hear this. They see the thunder and lightning. They see the noise of the trumpet. And then they're hearing the Lord say this to Moses. Remember, he said, they're going to hear me speak to you. And they're going to believe you, Moses, forever. Okay? And it says, All the people saw thunderings and lightnings, the noise of a trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. And they said unto Moses, Speak thou with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak with us, lest we die. Okay. So, God has already proposed what is ultimately the Old Covenant to them. But notice how they respond to what God says. It says, speak, they say to Moses. Remember, he says to Moses, they will believe thee forever. In other words, they believe Moses forever, okay? And then they say to Moses, Speak thou with us, and we will hear. In other words, we'll listen to Moses, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. They don't want to have a direct communication from God. They're scared of that, lest we die. Okay? They want Moses to serve as an intermediary. They just want to follow Moses. And this is kind of a foretype of the whole, failing of Israel. When Christ comes, who is God, they don't want to hear from him. We follow Moses. And so Moses says unto the people, Fear not, for God has come to prove you that his fear may be before your faces, that you sin not. So in other words, God's scaring you so that you'll take him seriously and not sin. And the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near unto the thick darkness where God was. And the Lord saw unto Moses, Thou shalt say to the children of Israel, You have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. Thou shalt not make with me. You shall not make with me gods of silver, neither shall you make unto you gods of gold. An altar of earth shalt thou make unto me, and that shalt sacrifice thereon thy burnt offerings, thy peace offerings, thy sheep, and thine oxen, in all the places where you record my name, and I will come unto thee, and I will bless thee. And if thou wilt make me an altar of stone, thou shalt not build one of hewn stone, for if thou lift upon thy tool upon it, thou hast polluted it. Neither shalt thou go in the steps of mine altar, that thy nakedness be not discovered thereupon. So God is starting to establish with them that he does not want them to not only make a graven image of himself, but put their hand and do any work upon any altar that they make for him, because he is proposing to them that I don't want your work going into my worship. And then he proposes to them, If thou buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years shall he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go free for nothing. Why? Because the Jews are going to be in bondage until the millennium. In the 7th, he goes free. And God's going to start to give him all his laws there. But the major point is that these laws are based on it. If you do this, then you'll be my people. And Israel's saying, we don't want to speak to God directly. We want Moses to speak to us. And so the rest of it is going to go through these laws. The rest of Exodus is going to go through these laws and the making of the tabernacle and all this stuff. And then it's going to go through the golden calf incident. So ultimately, when Moses goes up to get the law, because remember, they don't want to hear from God anymore. So when Moses goes up to get the 10 Commandments carved in stone from the Lord, they immediately go to disobeying him. Exactly what he told them not to do is not to make a graven image, not to make a graven image in the image of him to worship. And they go make a graven image like the gods of the Egyptians and say, this is our God who brought us up out of Egypt. And their plan was to take that golden image and go back to the bondage of Egypt and say, this is better than trusting the Lord day by day, moment by moment. In Egypt, at least we knew what we had to deal with. And so they don't know what happened to Moses, but they ultimately make an image of a beast under Aaron, their high priest. And their plan is to go back to Egypt. And then Moses comes down with Joshua, and he's all upset, and he destroys the covenant of the law. He throws it down. This is a type of the failure of the old covenant, because ultimately the old covenant is going to lead the Jews to make an image of the beast under their high priest and try to go back into the bondage of the law. This is what they're ultimately going to do. Moses is going to respond like Christ, and ultimately he comes down and he breaks the 10 Commandments, which is the old covenant. He breaks it. Now, it says, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mount, the people gathered themselves together in Aaron and said unto him, make us gods which shall go before us, for as for this Moses, the man that brought us out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what has become of him. Now, Moses, in a type, ascends, like Jesus ascends. And they get tired of waiting for him to come back. So what do? They go and make an image of the beast. Aaron said to them, break off the gold earrings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me. And all the people break off their gold earrings which are in their ears, and brought them to Aaron. And he received them at their hand, and he fashioned with a graving tool after he had made a molten calf, and said, these be thy gods, Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. So it's interesting. He makes a molten calf, and then he says, these be thy gods. Singular. Plural. When Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast unto the Lord. So notice a singular calf, plural gods, and he's going to have a feast unto the Lord. They rose up early in the morrow and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. This line is going to be right in 1 Corinthians. We're going to talk about how the Jews, God brought them out of Egypt, but then he slew them in the desert. And this is one of the reasons why they sat down to eat and drink and they rose up to play. They basically partied. They partied, they made a feast to the Lord, but they represented the Lord as a molten calf, a golden calf. And then the Lord said to Moses, get thee down. So remember, Moses ascended. Now he's going to descend. For thy people, which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them, and they have made a molten calf, and have worshipped it, and have sacrificed thereunto, and said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which have brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said unto Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may wax hot against them. So for those of you who aren't, I'm going to get eschatological for a second here. You don't think the Jews are going to be involved in God's outpouring of wrath is on the Jews. It's on the Antichrist kingdom. It's on the image of the beast. It's on the nation of Israel. Okay? It's the beast's kingdom that God is pouring out his wrath on. And the beast is ruling over Israel. Okay? Through the image of the beast. It says, let me alone, that my wrath may be hot against them, that I may consume them. And that's what they say. He consumes the beast's kingdom with his wrath. And I will make out of thee a great nation. Now, for those of you who have a problem with replacement theology and the idea that God started over with a new nation out of Christ to replace the Jews that rejected Christ, you need to look. God already says he's going to do this with Moses. People think, well, why would God say this? He's forecasting Christ. Remember, Moses is the type of Christ, okay? And so he says, I'm going to pour out my wrath against the Jews and consume them, and I will make out of thee, Moses, a great nation. And notice this is Moses as he's coming back down from the mountain. So it's a type of the second coming of Christ. Okay? The first coming is when Moses gets the law, and he goes up to get the law established in stone. And then the second one is when he comes down and they're breaking the law. And he says that he's going to pour out his wrath against them and make out of Moses a great nation. Okay? Now Moses besought the Lord his God and said, Why doth thy wrath wax hot against thy people, which thou hast brought forth out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Wherefore should the Egyptians speak and say, For mischief did he bring them out, to slay them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from thy fierce wrath, and repent of this evil against thy people. Notice, listen what Moses says to God to do. Repent. He calls on God to repent of the evil against thy people. Now, is God really doing anything wrong? See, this word evil means harm, okay? He's really begging God to turn away from the harm he intends to do to these people. But is God doing anything unjust? Absolutely not. Because he told them, he said, if you keep my commandments, you'll be to me a precious, peculiar people. Okay? And immediately they break his commandments. So now what are they to him? Based on his own word, nothing. You're nothing to me. I'm going to destroy you. And I'm going to make a new people out of Moses. So that is a major forecast type of the new covenant. The Jews are going to utterly fail to keep the covenant. God is going to break the covenant, and he's going to make a new people out of Christ, which is the church. He's already forecasted all this in Moses. So for those of you who are inclined towards dispensationalism and say, no, wait, God's still got a plan for Israel. Yes, he still has a plan for ethnic Israel, and that is to give them one last chance to receive Christ or be destroyed. That is his plan for future Israel. There is no promise. If you look at the prophecies about Israel in the last days, there's no promise that all of Israel will be saved. When Paul says all of Israel will be saved in Romans 11, he's talking about the whole of true Israel. He has already established clearly that true Israel are those who believe in Christ and are born again through him. He's not saying all ethnic Israel will be saved. He's saying the whole of Israel will be saved after the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. And yes, there will be Jews that come in after that. But if you read Zechariah, you got to get into Zechariah because, again, and we'll probably stop here with this typology because, again, there's multiple other types ultimately leading to Deuteronomy, which means second, and it's the type of the second covenant. So we'll probably just stop with Exodus right here. But when we get to Zechariah, remember, this is after God has destroyed Israel's Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, and now they're going back and they're rebuilding the temple. And this is the context of all this. God says to this, he says this about Israel, and this is a prophecy that happens in the days of Christ. He says, 3 shepherds I will cut off in 1 month, and my soul loathed them, and their soul abhorred me. Then said I will not feed you. That dieth, let it die, and that is to be cut off, let it be cut off. And let the rest eat every one the flesh of another. What is that about? This is about the ultimate destruction of the shepherds of Israel. Okay? So he's saying, 3 shepherds I cut off in 1 month. Well, who are these shepherds? The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and Herod, which is going to be the king of Israel. Okay, so he ultimately plucks up their nation, and it ends with everyone eating the flesh of each other, and because they're literally eating the flesh of their children and stuff like that in the siege of Jerusalem. He says, I will not feed you. They're starving to death in there. They're being cut off. They're being killed. And he says, and I took my staff, even beauty, and I cut it asunder, that I might break my covenant, which I had made with all the people. Now, there are people who will do all kinds of gymnastics and say, oh, that's God talking about his covenant he made with the Gentiles. No, it is not. This is talking about the shepherds of Israel. And here's why he does it. It says, and it was broken in that day, so the poor of the flock that waited upon me knew that it was the word of the Lord. The poor of the flock that waited upon him were the Christians. Okay? They knew when Jerusalem was destroyed that it was the word of the Lord, because Christ kept telling them Jerusalem's going to be destroyed and all your leaders, they're all toast. And it says, and it was broken in that day, and so the poor of the flock that waited upon me knew that it was the word of the Lord. This is the book of Hebrews. It's leading up to remember, Paul is going to say in Hebrews that the old covenant is annulled, or it's made void, and it's ready to pass away. In other words, it's still being carried on because they're still carrying on the temple sacrifices, but it has no power anymore. Because remember, Christ curses the fig tree and he says, no more will you produce fruit. Okay? And then when he physically destroys the city, now it's impossible. Even to the people who are blinded and still think they have hope in the old covenant, they can't even carry out the sacrifices anymore because the city's destroyed, the temple's destroyed, the priesthood is destroyed. There's no more priesthood. And it talks about them being many days without a priest or a king. They don't have a king over them. They don't have a priest over them. They don't have a Sanhedrin. They don't have the Pharisees teaching them. Okay? So all their shepherds are cut off. And they agreed to this deal. Here's what he says here. He says, and I said to them, if you think good, give me my price, and if not, forbear. He's saying, he prophesies to them centuries before that this is how you agree this covenant is over. Okay? And he says, so they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. When they paid those 30 pieces of silver to Judas to betray Christ, they bought their way out of the old covenant. They basically said, we're done with God being our God and we being his people. Here's the cost for him having served us as our God. In other words, his wages for serving, being our God. And then the Lord said unto me, cast it into the potter, the goodly price that I was prized of them. And they took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. And that's what Judas ultimately does with the money. Okay? Now, remember, Satan is possessing Judas when he does all this. Satan is possessing Judas when he gets the 30 pieces of silver. Satan is possessing Judas when he casts it into the house of the Lord. Okay? Literally, he's casting it into the house of the Lord. Why? Because what Satan is doing is basically he is acting as the intermediator for Israel. We want out of this covenant. And Satan, in the person of Judas, is receiving the money and then throwing it into the house of the Lord and saying, there are your wages for being their God. They're done with you. We don't want you anymore. as our God. Okay? He says, then I cut asunder my staff, even bands, that I might break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. And he said, and the Lord said unto me, take unto thee yet the instruments of a foolish shepherd, for lo, I raise up a shepherd in the land which shall not visit those that be cut off, neither shall seek the young one, nor heal that is broken, nor feed that standeth still, but he shall eat the flesh of the fat and tear their claws to pieces. What are you talking about? This is John chapter 5. When Jesus says, I came in my Father's name, and me you did not receive. Another will come in his own name. In other words, he's not going to do the Father's good will towards you. He's going to do his own will for his own pleasure. Okay? And him you'll receive. And he says, woe to the idle shepherd that leaveth the flock. A sword shall be upon his arm and upon his right eye. Now, who's the idle shepherd that leaveth the flock? That is ultimately the Antichrist who dies. A sword shall be upon his arm and upon his right eye. That's going to be the bolt of lightning that slays him, the sword that's coming out of the Lord's mouth, and it's going to cause his right hand to be withered, probably burned up, and his right eye to be shot out. Boom. His arm shall be clean dried up, and his right eye shall be utterly darkened, and somehow they're going to take what's left of this dude, hook him up to the image of the beast, and say he's still alive, he's still ruling through the image of the beast. Okay? That's why he's called the idol shepherd. Not I-D-L-E, I-D-O-L. He's an idol. He is the image of the beast. Okay, that image of the beast is the ultimate type of the golden calf. And it's at that golden calf that God is saying to them, I'm going to cut them off from being my people. They agreed to keep all my commandments. They said, if you do this, you'll be this. And they said, we agree, we'll do this. And then they immediately went and broke the first commandment, the big one. Don't make a graven image. And he said it twice already. Don't make a graven image. They heard it. They knew, don't make a graven image. And they went and did it. Took them 40 days to do it. It's a month and a week to do this. That's how fast they turned on God. And ultimately, Moses went down from the mount, and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in his hand. The tables were written on both their sides. On one side and the other they were written. And the tables were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God graven on the tables. When Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said unto Moses, there is a noise of war in the camp. And he said, it is not the voice of them that shout for mastery, neither is the voice of them that cry for being overcome, but the noise of them that sing I do hear. In other words, they're not in a war. They're just having fun. That's what you're hearing. You're hearing a party. And it came to pass, as soon as he came near into the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing. Now remember, you're going to have the people having a great festival when Christ shows up. Right? They're crying peace and safety because the 2 witnesses have been killed. And it's at the epitome of that the Antichrist is going to go sit in the temple and claim that he's God. And it says, and Moses' anger waxed hot, and he cast the tables out of his hands, and he brake them beneath the mount. He breaks the covenant. Now he's going to go back and get a second copy of it, because we're going to see this typology over and over. Why is there a second covenant? Why is there a second version of the law? And the answer is because there's a new covenant. There's going to be a new covenant with a law written on their hearts instead of the law written in stone that they just have to obey in order to get what they want in their flesh. Okay? And Moses said to Aaron, what did these people unto thee that thou brought this great sin upon them? In other words, Aaron did it. And he's saying, what did they do to you to make you do this? And Aaron said, let not thine anger, thy Lord, wax hot. My Lord, wax hot. Thou knowest the people that they are set on mischief. For they said unto me, make us gods which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what has become of him. We don't know what happened to him. And I said unto them, whoever has gold, let him break it off. So they gave it to me, and I cast it into the fire, and there came out this calf. Aaron is not owning what he did. He said he cast it in the fire, and there came out this calf. No, Aaron crafted that with his own hands. And when Moses saw that the people were naked, for Aaron had made them naked unto the shame among their enemies, Then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Who is on the Lord's side? Let him come to me." And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together to him. This is a type of the rapture. Okay? So they are naked. They are not clothed in robes of righteousness. Okay, in a type. They're naked. He said, "For Aaron had made them naked unto their shame among their enemies." Now what happened? Did they physically get naked? Were they fornicating and have orgies? Maybe. Or are they spiritually naked because of their sin? Regardless, it's a type of them being not clothed with the robes of righteousness, which are needed for them to be raptured. Okay? So then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Who is on the Lord's side? Let him come unto me." And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together unto him. Now, the Levites are going to be taken and made the priests of Israel. Okay? And they're going to be a foretype of the church. How they're set apart. They don't own land. In other words, they're not of this world. They have no possessions here, and they're clothed in linen, because that's a type of the righteousness of the saints, and are basically being born again. And they are he says he stood in the gate of the camp, and they are gathered to Moses, just like we're gathered to Christ when he comes back in a second coming. And he said unto them, "Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, put every man his sword by his side, and go in and out from gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, and every man his companion, and every man his neighbor." And the children of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell from the people about 3,000 men. That's going to be something that is going to be reversed in the book of Acts, because 3,000 people are going to get saved. But they kill 3,000 people. He sends them out a killing. And they're going to be a type of the armies of the Lord coming back with him, and then the Lord's going to kill the armies of the Antichrist. And Moses had said, "Consecrate yourselves today unto the Lord, every man upon his son and upon his brother, that he may bestow upon you a blessing this day." And it came to pass on the morrow that Moses said unto the people, "You have sinned a great sin, and now I will go up to the Lord. Peradventure I shall make atonement for your sin." And Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Oh, this people have sinned a great sin, and made them gods of gold. Now let, if thou wilt, forgive their sin, and if not, blot me, I pray thee, out of thy book which thou hast written." So notice Moses is attempting to atone for the sin of Israel by offering his own life in their place. He said, "Yet now, if thou wilt forgive them their sin, and if not, blot me, I pray thee, out of thy book that thou hast written." So if you won't forgive them, then kill me too. And the Lord said unto Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. Therefore now, go lead the people to the place which I have spoken unto thee. Behold, mine angel shall go before thee. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them." And the Lord plagued the people because they made the calf which Aaron made. So he is telling Moses about these people. Go lead them to the promised land. And I'm going to kill who I'm going to kill. I'm going to make their sin, I'm going to visit their sin upon them. Okay? So remember, what is their sin? Is it the golden calf? Is it the idolatry? Yes. But ultimately, it's wanting to go back to the bondage of Egypt. Okay? And the golden calf is the symbol of their wanting to go back to Egypt. Okay? Well, the symbol of Israel wanting to go back to the old covenant and back to the bondage of the law is going to be in the temple and ultimately in the image of the beast. Okay? So that is what you're going to see in the future with Israel, because they want to go back to the old covenant. Moses is going to be leading them towards new covenant, and he's going to be leading them towards the promised land. And there's going to be a people that do make it into the promised land, but they're not going to be these adults who are accountable for their sin. By the time they get there, everyone 20 years and upward, they're going to be dead. And it's going to be their kids, who probably were not taking part in the celebration because it was bedtime or whatever, that ultimately are going to make it into the promised land. And their sin's going to be visited upon them. And they're going to be blotted out of his book. For those of you who don't understand, this whole blotting out of the book thing. They were all written in the book. Those that sin are blotted out. Okay? Those that sin worship the image of the beast. Those that sin are blotted out. They never believed. They grumbled. Look, they followed him out of Israel. There are obviously some people among them who were obedient and put the blood on the lintels of the door. They followed Moses out. They were rescued from Pharaoh. They grumbled about water. Remember, they haven't been out of Egypt 90 days yet. That's how short all this is. And this is actually exactly 90 days. So 50 days after they come out, that's Pentecost. That's when they receive the law. And then 40 days later, they do this. So 90 days they've been out of Egypt. It's been 90 days since Passover. They have wanted to go back to Egypt, complaining because they didn't have food. God gave them manna. Then they want to go back to Egypt, complaining because they don't have water. God strikes the rock and gives them water. Now, the manna that came from heaven and the rock are both a type of Christ. He keeps providing to them through Christ, but they don't believe. Even though he's supernaturally provided food for them. If they're still here through this 40 days that Moses is up there, that means they're still getting manna. He's still supernaturally providing them food. They still get the waters at Meribah. If they need to go get some water to fill up their canteens or whatever. He has supernaturally provided for them, but they still don't believe in him, no matter how much he provides. And so when Moses doesn't come back for 40 days, which is kind of a type of, again, Christ leaving and then returning, they decide to go make the golden calf, and they want to go back to Egypt, which is going back under the law. Okay, this is exactly what Israel's going to do. And what Aaron does here is exactly what the false prophet does. Okay, the image of the beast ultimately, the golden calf ultimately represents the image of the beast. Aaron ultimately represents here the false prophet, and Moses ultimately represents Christ. Okay, but the way he goes down and he breaks the law, he breaks the old covenant with them, and then he's going to make it again, is a forecasting of the new covenant. And the way God says that he's going to wipe out Israel and then start over with Moses is a forecasting of the church. So the true Israel, the true firstborn, is Christ. The true Israel, in other words, the people of God, because remember, it's a many in one concept. Israel is Christ, and those who are in Christ, okay, are the people that God said to Moses, I'm going to start over. I'm going to make basically a new Israel through you. Because they would still been called Israel, because Moses was a descendant of Israel, and he would have started all over with this is important, a whole tribe, or a whole nation of Levites. Remember I said how the Levites are a type of the church? A whole nation of Levites. That's important. So he would have started over with a church of Moses. But Moses says, no, blot me out. And he intercedes for them because that's a type of Christ as well. And ultimately God is going to make a second set of tablets of the law, which is the type of the new covenant, and he's going to send them on their way. And then they're going to, after this, be taught to build the tabernacle. And the tabernacle is also a type of the old covenant, because the tabernacle is a type of our flesh. It's actually coated in skin. That's the outer layer of it, and it actually represents the human body as being temporary, having beauty on the inside because it has a type of Christ in the inside, and the Holy of Holies is where the Holy Spirit dwells, and all its parts and ordinances, which are kind of mapped out a bit in Hebrews, but they don't go into all the detail. They represent Christ in us. But that tabernacle is temporary because it's ultimately going to yield to a temple, which is more permanent. Just like our flesh is going to yield to an eternal flesh that's more permanent. And a Judite and a Danite take part in the building of the tabernacle. because there's a forecasting of the Antichrist in Dan being part of the tabernacle, and there's going to be a Danite that helps build the temple. So that's kind of it. We'll just leave it there at Exodus. I'm going to try to do, because again, numbers and Deuteronomy kind of bleed into each other. Numbers is the history, and then Deuteronomy. Leviticus is basically just going to be the Levitical laws and the ordinances, and there are a couple of things that happen in the book of Levites, more having to do with Aaron's sons dying, but it's mostly just rules and feasts and stuff like that. And there's a lot of stuff that could be talked about there, but Numbers is basically going to talk about the numbering of all of Israel, and then what happens in the years of their wandering, and then at the end of that wandering, that's where they're going to get into Deuteronomy, which is going to be right before they enter into the Promised Land. And in their wilderness wanderings, we're going to see Moses' failure, and also the failure of Israel to enter the Promised Land. And then Deuteronomy is going to represent those Israelites who do enter the Promised Land, and when they a second time affirm the covenant with God, they are uncircumcised when they do it. And that's important because it's in Deuteronomy where God ultimately promises that the Jews are going to get jealous of the Gentiles, and it's uncircumcised Jews who are basically the ones who are affirming this covenant. And then Moses dies, and then Joshua leads them to the Promised Land, and then he circumcises them right before he takes them to the Promised Land. So we'll get into that in a second video. Hopefully that will be the other part. So we'll call this the new covenant in Moses. And then for those of you who are watching this, if you guys are keeping me in prayer, if any of you guys we form more of a relationship or more friends, just so you guys know what's been going on with me, I'm actually I am prayerfully considering and getting close to committing to going to seminary, which would involve me moving from the UP of Michigan to Phoenix. A lot of changes that have been going on, a lot of trials, a lot of temptation, got COVID, still dealing with post-COVID symptoms, waking up trembling, going to sleep trembling almost every day, and it's a COVID thing I found out. Dealing with spiritual warfare and stuff, and ultimately dealing with God pushing me past a lot of fears, I think, to go after what I think I really want to, which is to get away from my recruiting work and focus just on teaching and study. And I don't know if that's going to lead to like a full-time, like a pastoral position or something like that in time, or if that's going to lead to just me continuing to study and being involved in the seminary setting and then maybe doing more of this. But I've been speaking with some friends who are Messianic Jews. They're actually from Israel. They were raised in Israel, so that's where their Messianic Judaism comes from. And they, one of the brothers is actually the head of a Messianic Jewish congregation in Phoenix. And that would basically be my primary source of fellowship when I moved down there. And then I would be going to a seminary where Wayne Grudem is actually one of the professors there, if everything works out. I'm still in, like I said, I'm in prayer mode on this. I'm trying to decide whether or not to sell my house or keep it as like a rental, and how much recruiting work I'm going to be doing down there, and just the logistics, what it's going to take for me to actually do it. But it's looking like God has provided some Christian fellowship and a place to live if I were to move down there, so I wouldn't have to buy a house or rent an apartment of my own. I would just be basically renting a couple rooms from a guy for my office and bedroom. So if any of you are lifting me up in prayer, or you guys, just sending up encouragement or whatever, that would be, I'll be making this decision probably to make the move over the next 2 months, and whether or not to sell my house, I'm going to be going down there to visit in probably 2 to 3 weeks. Hopefully I'll get the second part done before then, but that's what's going on with me. This study and stuff, one of the things I'm learning is that my apostles' teaching, for those of you, if you did buy a copy, there's a lot of mistakes in it. A lot of mistakes having to do with my own ignorance of Greek, basically. And, I don't know Hebrew nearly as well as I would like to. And what I would want to do is basically go to get formally trained in Greek and Hebrew. And then probably focus on the biblical languages and get like a master's divinity or master's of theology, and then focus on some key I guess, topics of, teaching on prophecy, typology, and eschatology. That would be where I want to maintain my focus, but be more refined in that, and making sure I'm not making kind of rookie mistakes or reinventing the wheel and things that other Christians have already come before me and done. Just basically with the work that I'm doing, I don't want to make mistakes that would discredit what I'm trying to do unto the glory of the Lord. So it's just something I'm learning that I probably need to submit to, and God's been doing a lot of work in me just towards humility and basically being able to listen to other people better and learn that I don't have to figure out everything on my own, that there are a lot of things that God has scattered throughout the body of Christ that I can learn from others and not have to redo everyone's work. And a lot of stuff I have learned on my own. So it's actually refreshing to be brought to a place where God is making it easier for me to trust in what he's doing through other people and not just myself, and showing me how there's pitfalls with that, and that I can, go forward and know that he's keeping me, and I'm not going to get deceived if I, put more trust in other people and, go to an institution and start learning in that way. So anyways, I hope you guys are blessed by this. Any words of encouragement or wisdom, or just, things you guys want to continue to study on. Like I said, I'm going to keep going with this, probably another part on Moses, and then we're going to look at Saul and David, and then we're going to look at Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah as, the major forecasts for the new covenant. And then, like I already showed you, the breaking of the old covenant in Zechariah, and then we're going to get into the New Testament and show in hindsight now how they're pointing back to the dissolution of the old covenant and the new covenant as the better covenant with better promises, and how it's better, how those are better, how it's a better covenant, and how it has better promises. So hope you guys are blessed by this, and we'll keep going with this, and hope you guys continue to grow, and we all grow together in Jesus' name. And have a great rest of your weekend. Batman out. Peace.
Peace, I'm out. I'm Batman.